fine. Before we get to these questions, let's speak about Purim that, as mentioned, is coming up in exactly a week from this Saturday evening and Sunday, not this coming weekend, but next weekend is the festival of Purim. Everyone, by the way, is welcome here at CBT at 8 p.m. immediately after Shabbat. We'll gather together. We'll perform one of the 4 mitzvahs of Purim together, which is listening to the Megillah. You'll also have the opportunity to fulfill the other mitzvahs of Purim, which is giving charity to the poor. We'll have bowls here, as we always do every Purim. And also the mitzvah of mishloach manot, of giving food baskets to one another. That's also a mitzvah of Purim. Food baskets that contain at least 2 different types of foods. It's important to know because it says manot in the plural term, which means foods, not just one food. So 2 different types of foods that carry 2 different blessings. So you can have cake, for example, and a bottle of water or tea or whatever it may be, or any other types of foods that you want. They have to be immediately edible because that's what manot means. And that's the commandment in the story of Purim. Just covering here the mitzvahs very quickly. So we said listening to the Megillah, giving charity to the poor. You have to give charity to at least two different people, poor people, or 2 different organizations that collect money for the poor, because it says matanot la'evyonim, gifts to the poor, again in the plural tense. So it can't just be just one gift to one poor person, but it has to be multiple gifts to multiple poor people, at least 2. And then the 4th mitzvah is to have a meal on the afternoon of Purim, on Sunday afternoon, that emulates the meal that Esther had in the Megillah story, the meal that really put an end to Haman's decree and was the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people. Those are the 4 mitzvahs of Purim. I'm going to go over the story of Purim itself and then try to analyze it in a very specific way so that we can really draw some important life lessons from it. Now, I know that many of you know the story, but just to go over it very, very quickly. In the 5th century BCE in Persia, which is today's Iran, there was a foolish, or at least unstable king by the name of Ahasuerus, who had an evil advisor by the name of Haman, right? You know the story. And Haman felt that he could issue any decree that he wanted. That's the power that he received, in fact, from the king. One of the decrees he issued was to put an end to the Jewish people. It was the first final solution, if you think about this, perhaps in Jewish history. Pharaoh wanted to kill the baby boys, not the girls. Haman wanted to kill every single one of us. Now, nashim, vataf, men, women, and children, as it says in the Megillah. First final solution in Jewish history. Now, Ahasuerus' kingdom was spread over 127 countries where the bulk of the world population lived. So really, this could have exterminated the Jewish people if this decree had been executed. The Jewish people, I'm skipping the first part of the story, which is also an important part, but I'm not going to go into it because I want to get to the gist of it. But the Jewish people had to devise a plan, right, to annul this terrible decree. One of the leaders of the Jewish people was Mordechai, was also nicknamed Mordechai a Yehudi. The first time we see in Jewish history that someone is actually nicknamed HaYehudi, which means the Jew. Mordechai the Jew was also one of the leading rabbis of the time. He was part of the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court that was in charge really of deciding the big cases for the Jewish people altogether during his times. Mordechai decided to convince his niece, Esther, who was also known as Hadass, according to the Midrash, or Hadassah, or Esther, to go and present her candidature to be the next queen. The king had just banished the king, Ahasuerus, remember he was unstable, he had just banished his wife, Vashti, because she refused to show up at a big feast that he made. Some say he actually killed her, but depends on the Midrash. The Midrash says that he just banished her. Some say that she committed suicide. There are many different opinions, but in any case, he didn't have a queen, so he was looking for a new queen. So Esther was convinced by her uncle, go and present your candidature. On that day in which the king, Achashverosh, had to pick his future wife, there were thousands and thousands of women lined up, but for some divine, mysterious, and miraculous reason, he put his eyes on Esther, who had not prepared herself like the rest of the ladies had prepared herself on that day. Remember, it was like a beauty contest, but she didn't put any makeup. She fasted for 3 days and prayed to God that she is successful. But anyway, he picks her as the next queen, as his wife. Now she hides her Jewish identity. She's now the queen of this massive kingdom, and no one knows that she's Jewish. Nonetheless, Mordechai secretly visits her every day, goes to the palace and visits her. One day, Mordechai, during one of his visits, sees 2 guards whispering to one another. He approaches them, and they're speaking in a foreign language. Mordechai apparently spoke 70 different languages, so he understood them. And he 70. By the way, if you're good at languages, it's not that, some of the languages like French, Italian, Spanish, the Latin languages share the same root, whatever. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, by the way, apparently spoke 20-something languages. I spoke to French with the Rebbe, and he spoke to me in French, even though he was Russian, and he spoke Yiddish, but whatever. So he spoke 70 languages, apparently, according to Midrash, but he understood them. And he understood that they were plotting to murder the king, Achashverosh. So he immediately goes and tells one of the advisors of the kings that, hey, these 2 guards are soon plotting to kill your boss, the king. So they are taken care of. In a good dictatorship, what happens is what happens in Russia today. If Putin doesn't like you, you know what happens, and that's what happened to those bodyguards. And it is written in the book of good deeds that Mordechai saved the king. Nothing is done with Mordechai. No reward is given to him until much later. When Haman finally issues this decree, the king gave him the full power to do that, to exterminate the Jewish people. As we know, he set a lottery in order to decide on the date in which the Jewish people will be exterminated. The lottery falls on the 13th of Adar. He was all happy about this because he said, Adar is a bad month for the Jewish people. How do I know this? Moses, the greatest leader, died during this month on the 7th of Adar. So I'm so fortunate that my lottery fell on the 13th of Adar because it's bad omen for the Jewish people during this time anyway. So I'm sure that I'll be able to exterminate them and nothing will happen. The Midrash points out that he maybe thought that it was a bad omen for the Jewish people during this month because Moses died, but he did not know that Moses was also born on this month. On the same day, by the way, on the 7th of Adar, 120 years earlier. So the birth of Moses actually signifies the opposite, that this is a good month for the Jewish people. But anyway, then the horses and the messengers are sent all over the kingdom to warn them that this is going to happen. The final solution is coming. And then at one point, the king could not fall asleep. He was turning around in his bed at night, as chapter 6 says in the book of Purim, of the Megillah. And he says to himself, well, maybe someone could tell me a good story that will put me to sleep. So he calls one of his advisors and he says, hey, why don't you take out the book of good deeds? Remember that? And read me a story from there. He takes out the book of good deeds. He opens it up. The Midrash again says that an angel came and moved the pages around so that it fell on the story of Mordechai saving the king. And he's reading the story. And the king now says, wow, who's this Mordechai? Was he ever rewarded for saving my life? And the man says, no, I don't see any record of his reward. So he shouts out, who's here in the palace? And Haman was in the palace to notify the king that he had prepared a tree to hang Mordechai from and to begin his final solution. So when Achashverosh says, who's in the palace? Haman comes running into the room and says, I'm here. And then the king says to Haman, well, what would you do to a man who did so and so for the king, saved his life? Haman was sure that the king was speaking about him. So he said, I'd like to have the greatest reward. And for him, he was a man who pursued honors and power. So he immediately tells the king, you know what you could do to a man like this? Thinking again that it's him. You can walk him in the streets on the horse of the king, with the garments of the king, with the crown of the king, and have the person that's walking him on this horse shout that this is the honor that a man that saved the king deserves. Achashverosh hears this, the king hears this, and he says to Haman, okay, that's a good idea. Now go and do this to Mordechai, who was his arch enemy, the Jew. Wanted to exterminate him and the Jewish people. And this is really the beginning of the end for Haman. He goes and does this, and he comes home, and his wife tells him, you'll never be able to destroy this nation. We know this nation. Many enemies before you have tried to destroy it. You're not going to be successful. That's one of the pivotal moments of the story, and it's really one of the pivotal moments of Jewish history, which in a way sets the tone for all future enemies, including the enemies right now that we have with the Hamas. They should hear that line loud and strong. Anyway, Haman comes home, again, he's downtrodden, and then he's invited to a meal by the queen. Now, I forgot to say, but the day before he was invited to a meal, and he felt also very special, which was, by the way, very brilliant psychologically by the queen to have this meal and invite only Haman and Achashverosh and the king, because Haman is thinking, oh, the queen loves me. I'm on the good side of the queen. Look how honored I am. And it builds his ego, and it blows it up like a balloon. And then the following day, what the queen will do is take out a little needle and pop that balloon more easily. It's hard to pop a balloon that's small and doesn't have any air, but it's much easier to pop a balloon that's big. Same thing with life. People have big egos fall very quickly, as we'll see in the story. So she builds up his ego. Oh, look, I love you. I honor you. I'm the queen. You're part of the royal family. And then he thinks, oh, everything's going great. That meal doesn't end up with any conclusion. She just says to Haman and to the king, I want to make another meal in your honor tomorrow. That night, remember, is when the story with Haman pulling Mordechai on the horse happens. And then the next day, Haman has to go back to the palace for this second meal, thinking that, okay, the queen loves me. During that second meal, all of a sudden, the king turns to the queen and says, look, we had a meal yesterday, you obviously want something. We're having a meal again today. You don't invite me to meals like this. What is it that you want? I'll give you even half of my kingship. And then the queen says, I'll tell you what I want. I don't want half of your kingship. All I want is to share with you that there's a person in this room that wants to destroy me and my nation. The king says, who is this? And the queen says, this guy here, Haman. The king is enraged to the point that he has to go and catch a breath of fresh air. He goes outside to the porch of his palace, and he's just enraged. What? My advisor wants to kill you, my wife? He wants to kill my wife? And he comes back to the room, and he sees Haman on the floor, on the knees of Queen Esther, saying, don't do this to me. No, you can't do this to me. At that time, also almost heavenly sent, another advisor comes into the room and says to the king, you should know that not only does Haman want to destroy, but he already built this tree on which he wants to hang Mordechai, the Jew. So the king now is so upset, he says, what? Really, he wants to kill my wife? He wants to kill her uncle? He wants to kill that nation? Let him be hung on that tree. On that day, Haman is brought to that tree and he's hung. Not only is he hung, all of his 10 children who were part of the decree were also hung. His 10 sons, they are already in the story of Purim. And of course, Mordechai now, there's a vacancy in the position of the senior advisor to the king because Haman was just killed. Mordechai is given the job, And that's when they decide immediately to annul the decree. They send messengers across the kingdom to announce to all of them, don't you dare begin this decree, because it has been annulled. The Jewish people are saved. The people now of the kingdom are so impressed by the miracle that just happened to the Jews that many are converting to Judaism. And that's how the story of Purim goes from one extreme to the other, from the depths of hell to the heights of heaven, from the greatest despair to the greatest hope and miracles. And that's really what the story is all about. One item that I did not mention, which I think is also one of the most crucial and pivotal points in the story of Purim, is that at the beginning, when Esther had to go and invite the king and Haman, but especially the king, to this meal, she could not just go and invite him, because the decree was that even if you are the wife of the king, you can't just walk into his room and say, hey, I want to speak to you. It doesn't work that way. You actually have to have the king turn to you first. If he doesn't turn to you, you can't speak to him, even if you're his wife. So, and anyone who would dare knock on his door and invite the king, or even speak to the king, or even just look at the king, would be killed, because he just bothered the king, even if it's his wife. Now, they needed to make something happen. And Mordecai told his niece, look, you're the queen, you're the only one who can really save us. You better go and speak to the king and invite him for the meal and share with him that this Haman wants to destroy us. And she says, I can't. He's going to kill me. That's the law. And then he says to her as follows. Really, this is one of the most important verses in the story of Purim, if not in the entire Bible. He says to her, look, Queen Esther, my beloved niece, redemption is going to come for the Jewish people. Whether you go to the king or you don't, I don't know how, but it's going to come. You now have the opportunity to be the channel for that redemption. If you don't do it, you and the house of your father will perish. But the redemption will come anyway. So history is calling your name. Are you going to heed the call? Maybe this is why you became the queen in the first place, he tells her. When she hears those words, she says, okay, fine. I'm assuming that role. I'll be that agent. I'll become that channel. And she goes and speaks to the king, and thank God nothing happened to her. And the king says, fine, I'll have this meal. Now, just 3 very quick lessons from the story of Purim. Lesson number 1 goes to this point that we just mentioned. And that is that God presents opportunities in front of our eyes each and every day. Now, the only choice we have is whether we will assume that role to become God's channel to his blessings or not. If we don't, we might just become a hiccup in history. We will perish, as Mordecai tells Esther. But if we say, you know what, yes, I'm lazy, yes, I'm tired, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to help that person anyway, and I'm going to become a channel for God's words anyway, or for God's actions anyway, then God says, okay, you'll be remembered in the annals of history as an Esther, as a true queen, as a true king, as a true hero. And we have opportunities like that each and every day. By the way, what Mordecai is saying has been proven by science, because when God decides that a blessing will come to the world, it comes. And it comes through those who are most ready to be the carriers of that blessing. Why am I saying that science proved that? Think about this. Every major revolution in history was carried by multiple people, unbeknownst to each other. The one who was most ready to be the carrier of that blessing, of that revolution, was the one that were recorded in the pages of history. For example, the invention of the telephone. Who invented the phone? No, he invented the light bulb and others. Alexander Graham Bell. Now, do you know, and you can look this up, that when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, there was someone else, also in America. Yeah, but not the telephone. But at the very same time, when God decides to send a blessing, it's coming down. And therefore, those who are open to it can become channels to it also. But at the very same time, there was a guy named Elisha Gray. You can look him up. Gray. Elisha Gray, who also invented the telephone. Now, the problem was that he came to the patent office in Washington, D.C. on February 4th, 1876, on a Monday morning, 3 hours too late. Alexander Graham Bell came first. He was the most ready to assume that role. And therefore, history's patent came first. History recorded him as the inventor of the telephone. What was Elisha Gray doing on that morning? Maybe he was having an extra long breakfast. Maybe he was on his porch, too immersed in his newspaper. Maybe he just woke up too late and he hit the snooze button. Who knows? But he certainly wasn't ready as Alexander Graham Bell was to be the channel of God's blessing, to bring the invention of the telephone to humanity. So history says, you know what? You and your house will perish, just like Mordecai tells Esther. And this is true for almost every invention. Look, even now, the revolution of high-tech technology. You have Bill Gates, you have Steve Jobs, you have others. When God decides to send a blessing to this world, it comes down. The question is, who's ready to be that agent? Will your ego get in the way? Will your excuses get in the way? Will your laziness get in the way? If it does, then you and your house will perish. If not, then you'll be a Queen Esther recorded in the annals of history. That's lesson number one. It's true for big opportunities, and it's true for the small opportunities of life too. Lesson number two is that it's interesting to note that in the story of Purim, God's name is not mentioned once. Not only that, but it seems like a natural turn of events. Seems like a story of nature of this world, nothing metaphysical, nothing miraculous. But that's exactly the point, because the story of Purim is trying to teach us that nothing seems as it reveals itself. You know, there's that expression that seeing is believing, right? Well, in Judaism, seeing is not believing. What you see is not what you get. There's so much more to every story, to everything under the sun, than what you see. In the story of Purim, just a few examples. This Achashverosh seemed to be so in power. Well, we saw that Haman was much more in power than he was. We thought that this orphan was had a future that was, I'm talking about Esther, had a future that was maybe in peril. No, she turned out to be one of the greatest heroes of Jewish history. We thought that Mordecai not being recorded, or not being rewarded, for the good deed that he did, was not going to change history, was going to be killed, was going to be hung. Well, it's wrong. Not only that, we see a king that's all powerful, but suffers from deep paranoia. And when his queen, the first queen, doesn't show up, he just banishes her or even kills her. We see all these different types of elements in the story that are not as they seem, because what you see is not what you get. That's perhaps also the reason, think about this, why in Judaism we close our eyes so much. When we bless our children on Friday night, as I do every Friday night, we close our eyes usually. When we say the Shema, we close our eyes. When you light Shabbat candles, you close your eyes. When during maybe the priestly blessings, we cover our eyes. There are so many different instances in which we close our eyes. Think about that. Why? Because Judaism is trying to make that point, that there is so much more to life than what the eye sees. The eye may see bodies, but really it's all about the souls. The eye may see news and, breaking news and reality, as we call it, but there's a divine that's really, or God himself, that's really being the chief orchestrator of everything. And this is what the story of Purim really teaches us, that yes, it's a natural turn of events, but there's a conductor that is really the master of the universe that's pulling all these strings. And sometimes it's true in our own lives and certainly in the world today that it seems like everything is going in the wrong direction, to say the least. Someone told me the other day, we're doomed. Can't stand that expression. We're doomed. But that's not true. Time and time again, Jewish history has proven otherwise. Because there's a God that if we can just have faith in him, that is really orchestrating everything from behind the stage. There is a producer to this play. The actors don't decide how the play will turn out. It's that producer that stands from behind the stage. So that's lesson number 2. And lesson number 3, I would say, is the lesson that on Purim, we too have to let go. We have to learn the lesson of letting go. You know, it's interesting because the word Purim means lottery. That's why Purim is named lottery, right? Purim. Now, many will tell you it refers to the lottery that Haman had in order to pick that date to exterminate the Jewish people, as we spoke about. But the Kabbalists will teach you that no, Purim is named lottery not just to refer to that date, but it's to refer to the attitude of the Jewish people, mainly Mordechai and Esther, who said to themselves, there's so much that is under our control. We'll do everything in our power. We'll send the queen inside. We'll pray. We'll fast for 3 days, something we didn't speak about. We'll do everything in our power. But at the end of the day, we'll let everything else up to the ultimate lottery, up to God. We can do what we can do, but we can't do what we can do. God can. And we'll throw everything else into that world of lottery so that God will take care of the rest. And that's really what Purim is all about. It's the greatest testament of faith that the Jewish people have had. And it's a testament of faith that we should exercise each and every day. There's so much we can control. I know sometimes we become control freaks or micromanagers, but it doesn't help us because at some point you have to say, you know what? I know I can't control this. Why am I even trying? But I do know that God can control this. So why don't I just give it over? Just like I would do in the lottery. Let me do a little Purim over here. And the more we do Purims, the more we create miracles. Now, of course, there are things that are under our domain that we have to control and that we have to mold and shape. But the things that we don't have control of, why are we even trying? Just give it over. Do a little Purim there. And the more Purims you do, the more miracles you'll discover. Because if you try and control everything, God will say, well, I have nothing to, I can't help you. You're not giving me room to help you. But if you say, you know what, God, I'm doing my best. Yeah, I need you here. Let's create a little Purim. Let me give this to you. I'll throw that in your department. That will be my lottery of the day. And God says, okay, you invited me into the picture. Let me create a story of Purim for you and bring you redemption. So that's the third, I think maybe even most important lesson of Purim. Those are the 3 big ideas of Purim. Let me go to the sheets and then we can, of the questions here for this roundtable discussion, and I can open this up to more. Oh, these are the same papers. That's right. Okay. So question number 1 here. I'm currently reading a book by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks called The Power of Ideas. It's a great book, by the way. I warmly recommend it. The Power of Ideas by Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, and is of blessed memory. In his thought for the day on anti-Semitism, he raises a thought: difference is what makes us human. And a society that has no room for difference has no room for humanity. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the idea that Rabbi Sacks has raised. I mean, of course, who am I to even give my opinion on Rabbi Sacks' words? But I will say this, that I think Rabbi Sacks here is speaking to one of the most fundamental ideas of creation. When God created the human being, as opposed to everything else that he created, animals, fish, birds, he created us individually. Animals were created in masses. Stars, galaxies were created in masses. Fish were created in masses. Human beings were created individually. Adam and Eve. Why? It's a question that many pose. But one of the greatest answers is because what God was trying to teach us is that we are each different from the other. Maybe animals are not, stars are not. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But human beings are very different. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a note to play in history. And no one is alike the other. Even identical twins are not the same. Think about that. Right? They might be the same. Even physically, they're not the same. As similar as they may seem. It's again because everyone has their individual role to play. Everyone is different. And if I try to make the other like me, if I superimpose myself on the other and crush the other's identity, then I have actually damaged God's creation and God's purpose of creation. And that's really what humanity is all about, as Rabbi Sachs puts it. In a society that has no room for difference, there's no room for humanity. I've used this metaphor many times, but it's like a symphony. The trumpet is to be the trumpet, and the violin is to be the violin, and the piano is to be the piano, and the bass is to be, and the cello is to be the cello. If the cello tries to be the trumpet, and trumpet tries to be the piano, and so on and so forth, then you'll damage the entire symphony. I think this is true for individuals. I think this is true for nations too. I think the Jewish nation has a unique role to play. And if we don't play it, we're hurting the entire world, the symphony of the world altogether. Our role is to be a light unto the nations. Our role is to share the message of the Torah. Our role is to be people, as Isaiah calls us, people of holiness, Am Kadosh, to share divinity, to share the message of oneness. And if we don't do that, if we don't play that instrument, then we're not just damaging ourselves and damaging our purpose, but we're damaging the symphony of the world altogether. So we can apply this also to the national differences between each and every nation. So that's that point. Next topic here, could you please ask Rabbi to explain why he thinks that there is no such thing as an atheist from his talk with university students on God. Yeah, I had a recorded talk with some university students, and in which I claim that there is no such thing as an atheist, or as they say, there's no atheist in foxholes, right? That's the expression. Now, why? Because everyone believes in something. Think about this. You are right now believing in the chairs that you're sitting on. Did you examine them before you sat on them to make sure that they don't collapse? No, not really. That's the way we act with the small things of life. It's certainly the way we act with the bigger ideas of life. Some people call God different names. Atheists might say that it's the universe or science. But these are just other names for God. And at some point, even Einstein, who was maybe the ultimate scientist, says that the more, that's what he wrote, that the more he examines the universe, the more he realizes that there must be a divine orchestrator to it all. Because at some point, if you are really honest enough, you come to realize that there are things that don't make sense. Just look at childbirth, for example, and there's so many other things. But at some point, you come to realize, wow, this is just miraculous. And if one is courageous enough and honest enough, as mentioned, that one realizes that there's no such thing as atheism. We all believe in something. We may not be honest enough to call it God, or we may try and be creative or a little too creative to not call it God, but we still believe in something. That's why I don't believe in atheists or in the term atheism. That's number two. And then one last point here. I thought this might be interesting to share or discuss for Happiness Hour. Why don't Jews put flowers near a tomb, near a grave? And instead of flowers, we leave a stone. It's true. It's not a Jewish custom. I'm going to explain why. It's not a Jewish custom to leave flowers by a grave or by a tombstone, or to bring flowers to Shiva homes, or to have bouquets of flowers in a funeral, as many funerals do have, funeral homes have. It's not. Instead, what we do is we bring round stones. and leave them on the tombstone. Why? So there are multiple reasons. I'll share with you two. Number one, because flowers die very quickly. And what we are trying to do here is respond to death with life. How can we respond to death with death? By bringing flowers that are going to die after 2 days or 3 days or however long they are. So it's almost like it's tactless, to say the least. I have other words for it, but let's call it tactless. Stones, on the other hand, round stones, represent life. Why? Because the roundness of the stone really comes to symbolize that endless cycle of life. And although our bodies may die, our souls are eternal, just like the roundness of that stone. And that's why we put those stones on tombstones, again, to answer death with the eternal life, or what symbolizes the eternal life. That's point number one. Point number two, think about this too. And I don't know if it's mentioned here or not, because there's a whole other paragraph. But point number two is this. Flowers represent the temporary in life. The roundness of the stone represents what is permanent in life. The temporary in life dies with us. The cars that we buy, the houses that we buy, the clothing that we buy, at the end of the day, they all die. We don't take them with us. And in a way, when we bring flowers, what we're trying to say is that, hey, there's importance to the temporary, while there is not. When we bring stones, round stones, again, particularly round stones, what we're trying to say is that, yes, the temporary, those things that may have smelled good and looked good, like flowers, are non-existent anymore in that person's life because he's dead, physically dead. What is still important for this person and for the soul that is still very much alive is that which was permanent. What? That cycle of life. How vibrant that cycle was. How filled with meaning and impact it was. So when we put a stone on a tombstone, we're trying to actually speak to the dead and say, your flowers of life, your cars, your mansions, may no longer be with you. But all the impact that you left in the life that you lived, in the true life that you lived, is always here. And that's a deeper reason, Kabbalistic reason of why we again put round stones instead of flowers on tombstones.